a ton of insight on how they choose the leaders in your hospital or in your institution. And know what a leader looks like. Watch and observe good and bad leadership. And when you notice a problem or an issue, one of the statements that has really helped me that I was taught by one of my leadership training classes that you all may have heard is change furious to curious. So, you know, when you walk in the OR and they don't have the instrument that you use every single time in every single case, but for some reason they don't have it that day, instead of losing it, which I have to admit I've done in the past, but I try to do with a lot of grace, change your furious attitude to being curious. I wonder why the instrument isn't here, being that I've done this operation the same way and the last 10 times I've used the same instrument. Do you know if there's a reason why I don't have my instrument? Something like that. And so if you change furious to curious and take 2 or 3 seconds to breathe, you'll be able to control some of your emotional response to what we know is important, and it's important for patient safety and other things. So changing furious to curious, I think, has been a good advice for me. And then the other thing is, if once you've identified the issue, take it to the leadership and say, you know, I can't get the same instrument, my tray's not the same. Is there any way we can institute a process for having the same trays, et cetera? And so once you start trying to address the problem and not just complaining about it, you are interfacing with the leadership of the hospital. And once you set up those meetings and are interfacing, they know you care about the outcomes of the patients, you care about patient safety, you care about efficiency, and that will go a long way as well. And then you'll start to get more committee invitations based on the fact that you actually care and are trying to change something instead of just complaining. When you're at a national meeting or a department meeting or in private practice, just a conference, ask questions so they hear your voice often. That helps them understand that you're thinking and you're paying attention and you're not just sitting in the meeting. If you're a person who's in academia and research, of course, if you see day-to-day things in the hospital that are your routine, question things that are routine. That can be the source of a novel research project. If you notice a way we're taking care of patients postoperatively that seems very routine and you don't see any data on why we take care of patients that way, that might be an opportunity for you to ask a research question. When you get to a point where you feel that you have command of an area and you would like to be a leader, you don't be afraid to ask for a title or a position. Don't be afraid to go to your division chief and say, hey, you know, I'm really interested in quality and looking at this NSQIP data. Can I be the next associate chief of quality, or can I be the associate chief of this? Ask and talk to your division chiefs about and your department chairs about leadership positions. When you're interested, of course, you'll have to be qualified, but you'll be surprised when you ask, and I had to do that at MD Anderson. I had been in the position for 4 years, and I said, you know, I'm doing all the work of the pediatric, excuse me, division leader for surgical oncology. Can I have that title? And then the next year I got that written into my contract that was part of my responsibilities and my title. So make sure you ask for leadership positions. The other thing is, in academia, you want to decide early in your career what you want to be known for. So if you want them to say, hey, that's Andrea, she does oncology, that's how you have to think. That's how you have to plan your presentations. That's how you have to plan your abstracts. You should be targeting 3 meetings a year with your abstracts so that you have at least 3 publications a year. And that you also need to sort of pick your meetings. So if you want to be a quality person, make sure you go to at least 1 or 2 quality meetings a year, et cetera. So you start to get to be known in those settings so that 5 years out, they go, oh yeah, that's so-and-so, she does X or he does X. So that's really important to think about and ahead of time. It's the other way to get into a leadership role is to apply and interview for jobs you want. And women are very characteristically underestimate themselves. Men will apply for a job that they are clearly not qualified for, and believe me, I've seen these applications. Apply for the job, even if you think you're not quite qualified, and if you get invited for the interview, just the experience of the interview will help you a ton, because then you'll get used to the questions they ask. If they don't choose you for the job, you'll get used to the characteristics that they're looking for in someone they've chosen. So get experience interviewing in the jobs that you want, and don't be shy about applying for things that you might not think that you're qualified for. You probably are overqualified for that. Just remember that as women in general, we tend to underestimate our skill set. And we are much more skillful than we recognize. So you might want to chat with one of your friends and colleagues from another institution and say, hey, brag about yourself. Say, I'm doing this, this, and this, and this. What do you think? Do you think I should do this, or do you think I should do someone who's not in charge of, not part of your division and not in charge of evaluating you? That's also really been really helpful for me. And then the last thing I want to mention is to identify your mentors. I have benefited a ton from my pediatric surgery mentors, and I don't want to name or list people because I'm afraid I'm going to forget someone. But when I was in the latter stages of the position I have now, I was able to call them on the phone and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking. Am I thinking correctly? Should I take this job? Should I not take this job? And that was extremely helpful. The other thing to note is that how I got invited to this particular position in an interview was because of a grand rounds presentation that I gave. So every presentation that you do can lead to job opportunities as well. But run that by your friends that are not at your institution, and just be very open and outright about bragging about yourself. Women are sometimes shy about bragging about their accomplishments. So I'll stop there and ask if there's any. Is it question time for questions, Jennifer, or should we wait to the end? Now? Okay.
Yeah, we can take some questions now because we've got some time before our next speaker. It looks like one of the questions from the chat is, do you admit it when you feel like you have a lack of qualifications, or just fake it till you make it?
Well, when you submit your CV, they'll tell you, if you don't get invited for an interview, they'll tell you that that'll tell you that you're not qualified. But there's no downside. There's absolutely no downside to sending your resume and them not inviting you for an interview. The other thing you can do is ask your mentor, hey, this is what I have. That's what I did, because when I wasn't really looking for the surgeon-in-chief job at the time I was offered, the position. So I asked one of my mentors, hey, am I really ready to be the surgeon-in-chief? And she's like, oh yeah, you're good. But I needed somebody to say that out loud to me before I started interviewing. So run your CV by your mentors and they'll let you know too.
Another question that someone had was, do you have any advice on how to be a good mentee?
Yes, because I've had good and bad mentees and mentors in both directions. To be a good mentee, offer to take your, first of all, schedule short meetings. My calendar every day is packed with back-to-back meetings every single day. I have 12 to 14-hour days from 6:30 in the morning till 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and that's regular for me, which is fine. But I'm not going to have, even though being a mentor is really important to me, I'm not going to have an hour necessarily to talk to the mentee. So if you can schedule a 20 or 30-minute meeting, you're more likely to be able to connect with your mentor. The other thing you can do is offer to take your mentor out to dinner with his or her partner so that it's more of a relaxed environment, and you can offer to pay for dinner and take them out, and that will, for them, kill two birds with one stone. They'll be able to be with their partner, and they'll be more willing to spend more time with you when their partner is present for dinner or for cocktails.
Do you have any advice on how to choose a good mentor? Do you just ask someone, or?
Yeah. In order to identify a good and bad mentor, you need to have someone who is who's not threatened at all. So you can't have anybody that is at your same level. So you have to have a full tenured professor. It has to be a tenured professor because you don't want your work to threaten or be dependent. You don't want them to depend on you for them to get advanced. So they have to be in a position where they have no worries about their job security and about their position in the institution. Then you need to have someone who understands how to navigate that environment, but not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to be a surgeon, But for example, I was doing basic science research, and I needed to know, you need to know as a mentee where to submit your data and which grants to write and what meetings to go to. So I don't necessarily need to have a surgeon that would tell me where to submit my Ewing sarcoma research to. So I can have a pediatric oncologist as long as that person's integrated into the same community. But what you don't want, you want to choose a mentor that has the same lifestyle and pattern that you want. What I mean by that is I had 2 days a week of protected time and 1 day a week of clinic and 1.5 days a week of OR time. That's how my week was structured. So I chose a mentor after I got rid of the one I had that had a similar structure to their time and had similar goals. So if you want to be an 80% researcher, whether you are doing basic science or clinical research, you might want to pick somebody that has 80% research time. If you're in private practice and you're doing private practice, you want to pick somebody that has a similar time constraints.
Right. It looks like there are two similar questions. One is what to do if you get into a job and things don't turn out the way you want. So how do you exit that without burning bridges? And the other similar question is there a good way to, or how do you be stealth about interviewing at other places? Or should you always be open about your desire to change positions with your institution?
What was the first part? I heard the second part.
Oh, okay. The first one was if you get into a position and you find that job is not a good fit, how do you change?
Okay.
What's a good exit strategy without burning bridges?
I think just being honest is a good exit strategy. I had to leave my first job in less than 2 years, and after a year I realized it wasn't going to work because I didn't have any protected time to do my basic science research. And so I was just very honest with my boss and said, I don't have time to pursue this in this environment. And then you give them an opportunity to make any changes that you might think is necessary for you to stay. And if it's just a family issue, you just have to say it's a family issue. My family, for whatever reason, can't stay. And I think honesty is the best way to approach that. As far as interviewing at other jobs, when you're interviewing at other jobs, it's a little bit sensitive. I always told my boss when I went to interview somewhere, you shouldn't do it as a threat, though. You shouldn't say, oh, I'm interviewing somewhere else, and now I need you to give me this. Don't interview somewhere else unless you really want that job. I don't think it's fair to the people involved to waste their time. But if you really do want to look for another position, that would be an opportunity to talk to your chair. And if they want you to stay, they will say, well, what do you need to stay? And then that's your opportunity to iterate what you want as a retention package. But if they don't want you to stay, it could be very illustrative because they could say, well, that's wonderful. Let me know where you want me to send your letter of recommendation. So it might be confirmatory to have that conversation that you do need to leave if they don't offer you an opportunity to stay in that location.
All right, and then we have one last question that we're going to take before we go on, and that is, how do you go about establishing a basic science or transitional lab when beginning your surgical career and negotiating for protected time for basic science?
Well, the first part of that is making sure you have a mentor. My failed experience was because I did not have a mentor. I thought I could do it on my own. And no matter how smart or committed or dedicated you are, you need someone to advocate for you, to let your boss know that you need this protected time. I was doing my research my first 2 years out of fellowship on nights and weekends, sacrificing a ton of family time because I was determined to get the research done, and it just didn't work. I wasn't smart enough to know that when they offered me 1 day a week and it wasn't really protected, that it really wasn't going to happen. So I think that you need to identify a mentor who's going to be in your corner, and then make sure there's someone else in the institution who has protected time for research. So where I was, that particular hospital, it was a freestanding children's hospital, and there was not one surgeon in the entire building in any subspecialty doing basic science research. So you can't be the first. So there has to be they have to have a pattern for how they manage surgeon scientists, either clinical or basic science. They have to have a pathway for them and an expectation with protected time, space, and startup funds. That's the expectation. When I left my first institution and went to MD Anderson, right away they said, okay, you want 40% protected time, here's your startup money, here's your space, here's your mentor. It should be very routine. If there's no one else in that institution who has protected time, you don't want to be there. Or if there are very few people that have protected time, or if there's no surgeons that have protected time, that's not a place you're going to be successful.
I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Hayes-Jordan, for participating. We're going to move on to our next speaker.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. And I want to acknowledge one of my new mentors, Roberta Sanino. I see her in the, she's an awesome resource. So hopefully she can speak up and answer you guys' questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, and if we have time, we'll do the same thing and take questions at the end. Our next speaker is Dr. Eunice Huang. She completed her medical school at the University of Southern California Keck School of Medicine and general surgery residency at LA County and University of Southern California Medical Center. She went on to complete pediatric surgery fellowship at Le Bonheur Children's Hospital at the University of Tennessee, and she holds a master's in epidemiology and as well as numerous publications. She is currently the Associate Division Chief of Pediatric Surgery and the Program Director for the Pediatric Surgery Residency, as well as the Chief Research Biomedical Informatics Officer for the Children's Foundation Research Institute. Welcome, Dr. Huang.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for being a little bit late. We just finished our Pediatric Surgery Research Collaborative meeting, and it went a little bit long because we're discussing different new topics for studying because of the COVID situation, and so I completely lost track of time. But I am so bummed I missed Dr. Hayes-Jordan's talk because I would have loved to hear it because I'm sure I can learn a whole bunch from her. So I am going to just tell you a little bit about sort of how I got here. I think if you asked me 10 years ago if I was going to be here doing what I'm doing, I would not probably have said that, and I've been very appreciative of every opportunity that was given to me. And I feel a little bit, I want to thank Claudia for inviting me to participate in this panel. I was very honored to be here. I feel like based on the number of people I'm seeing in the audience that I'm not sure if I am really could sort of, I think a lot of people in this audience could maybe possibly give more wisdom than I can. When I did my pediatric surgery training, when I finished, Max Langham, who was my chief at that time, and sort of back to the discussion of having good mentors, I think that's extremely important. He sat me down when I finished and he asked me what I wanted to do. And the discussion was, he said, you can't just go out and practice pediatric surgery. If you want to be an academic pediatric surgeon, you really kind of need to have a direction. And so that's what started me off on the pathway of getting additional education, which I got my master's in epidemiology as a junior faculty. And so that I could learn how to do research and statistics and all those skill sets that we don't learn very well in medical school and residency. So that I could embark on the pathway to do clinical research. And really my interest was in colorectal diseases, Hirschsprung's, and anorectal malformation. And so I knew that I really needed to be able to understand how to look at rare diseases. So in the midst of all that, I learned about informatics. I really kind of took that opportunity to learn about big data because I was just really coming online at that time, because recognizing that since I was going to study rare diseases, that was just a skill set I needed to have. And some of this was then just sort of being in the right place at the right time. So after getting some of that training just through mentorship as a part of my master's program, we were at a time in our institution where we needed to build our internal research core and actually develop a biostatistical core as well as biomedical informatics core. And I just happened to be one of the few people standing in our institution who really had an interest and passion in that and had some expertise in it. And so that's how I became the director of the BMIC. And that sort of snowballed over time. To just more leadership and really kind of being the research informatics the Chief Research Informatics Officer. So a lot of my work in that world is administrative. It's just making sure that we have the resources necessary to be able to service all of our pediatric researchers in terms of helping them manage their data and access appropriate data for research within the clinical world. So the other component, the other job that I hold is the program director job, and I think really for me a lot of that, how I came to that position was partially just being able to have the opportunity to work with fellows, and then Max was moving on to additional leadership position, and so that job became open, and I just had the benefit of being able to step into that position. I think I've really loved this position. I think it's one of the times where really kind of the whole mentorship collaboration is the most robust, because we have fellows who come in and they teach us a lot at the same time that we teach them a lot, and it is really, you know, you get to see that generations of training somebody, seeing them go out and do amazing things, and then seeing them mentor other people. I think this is really kind of one of the best jobs that I have. So if I were to say to people of how do you come on board and start your career and move ahead and identify leadership positions, I would say that the most important thing is for you to really identify your passion early on and do iterative evaluation of what's most important to you. I think anytime you start on your career, there's always 100 things, you know, kind of coming at you, and because you are smart and you are motivated and you are curious and you are just really excited and you have a whole bunch of energy, every time somebody tells you about something, you're like, oh, that's really, really cool. I would love to do that. I would love to do this. I would love to be a part of that committee. I would love to participate in this. And so I think it's really hard to sort of sit yourself down and kind of be really honest with yourself. And I think some of that honesty is just learning to really know yourself and be proud of yourself and know where your strengths are, know where your weaknesses are, and then being okay with that, and then really being able to utilize your strength and say, okay, I'm actually really probably a much better surgeon than I am looking at a petri dish. And even though I think that scientific question is really important, I think I'm much better here. So so I think doing that self-care and self-knowledge is really important, and I think that helps you identify where you need to be. And then when you do that, you could sit down and actually write down what you want to do, and that helps a little bit with honing in on really important stuff. You know, my husband, he's big into sort of sports shooting, and he always talks about, you know, aim small, miss small. And so I think it's very important early on that you're as focused as you could be, because you naturally always become sort of diffused as time goes on and people try to get you involved in things that they're doing. But if you start very focused, then you're more likely to actually accomplish the thing that you set up. I hope I didn't make a really non-PC statement there, but so anyhow, so that's one thing. I think the second thing I would say is that I would say to everybody that really recognize that your voice is valued and use it wisely. So maybe less so today, but I think in a lot of ways a female surgeon in our world sometimes is a little bit different. And I think we have the opportunity and the maybe personality, perspective, whatever, to bring something new to the conversation when you're in a room with a bunch of different people. And I think that it's really important for us to value that and to use it wisely. So you want to try to lean in, like we talk about, and just speak up when you think that you have a perspective and nobody else in the room sees what you're seeing. You're thinking, this doesn't seem quite right, but be willing to actually stand up and say something. But also use it really wisely, so don't be the squeaky wheel where you're always complaining about how things are not working quite right because you want to come at 8 o'clock to operate, even though the OR starts at 7:30. You know, you kind of have to pick your battles and be really intentional about where you put that voice. But I think in a lot of ways, maybe because we're maybe sometimes more naturally relational, I think sometimes women do see things that are going on that are out of the line of sight for people who are in leadership. And I think it's really important to, when you see that, to speak up for those who maybe are not getting the attention that they need. And I think one way that we do that for each other is really kind of amplifying each other's voice. If you're sitting in the committee meeting and somebody does not, somebody says something and you think actually is a valuable statement, but it's not heard, to really be willing to step up and amplify that voice. So I think that's a helpful thing to do. And I think one of the last things I would say is that what I've learned over time is practicing the habit of teamwork. We all get much further if we work together. And so one of the things that I've really done since I've started is, and part of it is because I am actually not a natural standout person. I'm actually fairly timid, if I could say so myself. And so I learned early on that I could actually identify people who had the same passion as I did, and if we put ourselves together as a group, then it was a little bit easier for me to step up and go to somebody who may be a little bit more intimidating and say, that we need to do this. And so most of the activities I've done have always center, if I kind of go back and think about and tell you the things that I think I've been successful at, or I'm very proud of that we accomplished at our institution because of work that I've been involved in, I would say almost all of them are associated with teamwork, of teams I've built, or teams I've helped build, or teams I've helped supported so that we could get an endeavor done. So we all get further, much further if we work together. And so I think that's the other part that I would say is really important.
Thank you. I think we have at least one question, a couple questions that have come up. The first one is, what happens when you are the only female voice in the room, as that so often happens in academic medicine, and how can you be amplified without being shrill?
That's such a good question. I was just telling my husband this morning I was trying to learn how to speak with a lower voice, and he said, "Oh, please do not do that. Your voice is very pretty the way it is." I think, again, that comes back to just finding partners or people who have similar views as you. Speaking out when you're the only person in the room goes back to just being intentional about when and where it is appropriate. And I've sort of learned this over time, that there are certain times where, so one thing I learned, and I'm really curious about other people who are in leadership and who have to run big meetings and things like that, that sometimes being in that big room when you see that the momentum is going this direction and it's really not the right direction, and you really need to stop it, but you're not quite sure how, recognizing who started that momentum and recognizing whether you have the ability to actually stop it by making a statement in the room. And some of that actually means that you have to know the players in the room and kind of their personalities and where they're coming from and what their focus is, and maybe some of what their sense of what threatens them. And then just recognizing when to have that conversation. So sometimes in a certain environment, when you have a very collaborative group that's very closely knit, and you guys are always just sort of kind of being very direct to each other, it's okay to say things in that big group. But sometimes you're in a big meeting with a lot of different leaders and you don't actually know each other very well, that may not be the best time to actually have that conversation. Really kind of the best time to have that conversation is allow the meeting to finish, and then after the meeting, going one-on-one to the person that you think really needs to kind of help you work this out, to have a one-on-one conversation. So I think sometimes being that single voice in the room, it is important to know when it is good to speak up and when maybe you need to have a backroom conversation before you bring this back to the main group to discuss in further detail. And then I think word usage is really important. People always talk about, you always have to be curious when somebody comes up to you and you're like, why did you do this to my patient? That's really kind of not the way you approach things. You always try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt that people are smart. They try not to do things just nilly-willy, and they always have thought about it. So if my partner decided to do something for my patient that is different from what I would have done, there's probably something that they thought about before. And it's really kind of just being very intentionally curious to identify what that is, recognizing they always have the best of intentions. And sometimes that's really hard when you're tired, because you just sort of want to just, kind of spit out whatever you want to say. But I think for me, I try to always be well rested when I have these difficult conversations, so that I could try to be as positive as possible when I have these conversations with people.
And is there any difference in how you would respond for someone who's a junior faculty in terms of trying to speak up without being a squeaky wheel?
I think for junior faculty, if you want to speak up to a senior person and you feel like they will not respond well, I think it is very important to find a mentor or a supporter, I would say. I think the sponsor, I guess, is probably the best word. So if you have somebody that you feel like really is affecting your ability to complete your task, ascend in your profession, but you don't feel like you could actually speak to them about it, or if you spoke to them, it would not be received well. I think the best way is to, for example, if within your department, to identify somebody who you might be able to use as a sponsor, because they have no dog in the race or whatever. They have no bias to the problem that you're having with that person, and they probably hopefully you find somebody who's at the same level as a senior person you want to talk to, and then and have a conversation with them to see if they would help you, or that they would either speak on your behalf or they will be with you when you spoke to that person. And it's always a very, very good idea for those difficult conversations to practice with somebody else, so that the language comes across appropriately. So you're as positive as possible, as open as possible. And then you have to actually prepare and be ready to listen to them. I think sometimes by the time we want to have a conversation with somebody that we're having problems with, we tend to have already made a judgment on them. And then when you have a conversation with them and that your judgment was actually incorrect, it's very difficult to correct. So you have to really be willing to accept that when you have the conversation with them and they say, you know what, I actually did this because of X, that you're willing to accept that and change your perspective on what actually happened.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions. When you are applying for jobs, what do you look for to identify places that will be supportive of you pursuing your particular goals and leadership ambitions? I
think I would really kind of echo what Dr. Hayes-Jordan said. I think that you need to see a track record that they have done what you want to do. So, so I would say that, so I will say personally for myself, had I known that I wanted to be an informatics person, it wouldn't have really kind of made a lot of sense for me to, I just happened really kind of my position and what I've learned and what I've done was really kind of opportune. I just happened to have this interest and there was an opening here. But I think if somebody came up to me and asked about wanting to get a PhD in informatics, I would certainly point them to places that has actually had a track record of producing that product. So I think it's very important. Again, we're back to you need the focus. So if you are able to come up with a very specific plan of what you want to do and how you expect that you're going to achieve it, and how much time you think that you're going to need to achieve that. And so for those of you who are fellows and about to graduate, you'll probably need the help of your program director or somebody within your division or department who is doing what you think you want to do, and they could help you write out your plan for the next couple years. Usually it's 1, 3, 5 years. How much time you would need, whether that means you need a 40% protected FTE 2 days a week, or you really don't need a lot of time, or you need to go get additional training in whatever area that you want. And then once you write that out, then when you go out to interview, you could look at those programs that are there and see if there's anybody with what you think you want to do on paper at that institution. And I think very I think very, very specific conversations with the person who is recruiting you about that is extremely important. The tendency is, and I will say that I have the same problem, it's very difficult to lean in and say, actually, I need, they said, okay, I'll give you 20%. You said, no, I really need 60%. It is hard to make that statement because you want to be liked. You want them to be like, you're the best thing since sliced bread, and I just want you. And you're like, I'm sure I could just make Saturday a work day and do that other 20% then. It's really important not to do that. It's really important for you to know exactly what you want, and then look at the institution you're going to and making sure that there are other people who have done what you want to do.
Okay, and then our last question is kind of a two-part. It's how has being a woman helped you as a program director? And as a program director, do you have any advice for upcoming pediatric surgery fellowship applicants whose research or conference time presentations have been affected by COVID-19?
So as a woman, as a program director, I see Laura's on the screen. She's smiling. So I don't know. I like to say that my door is pretty open, and I have a lot of conversations with my fellows about all kinds of crazy stuff. Not to say that a male program director wouldn't do the same thing, but I think that one of the things I really do try to keep track of is the emotional well-being of my fellows, and then trying to make sure that they have family, that they're doing okay, and try to just be aware that there's a lot more to life, even though we do we do work our fellows pretty hard. That there are other parts of their lives, and so we do try to be aware of that and making sure that they are actually well. So I'm going to give a plug to the app. We're doing a pediatric surgery fellows coaching project actually this coming year, where we're going to randomize our fellows to either being coached or not being coached. And I think that's totally awesome. I was part of the AWS coaching project, and that's really kind of sold me on coaching. I think it's extremely important to be able to self-reflect and then find your own strength to make decisions and create opportunities and things like that. So I try to bring that a little bit to how I have tried to bring that a little bit to how I treat the fellows as a program director. So I find that a lot of fun. In terms of people coming up for the interviews, I think what I would say is that just remember everybody is in the same boat. So you're not going to get compared to somebody who, except for maybe rarely, somebody who did all the meetings last year and had a whole bunch of publications, and you don't have that many because you were in COVID. I think likelihood is that you're going to get compared to everybody else who actually is in the same environment as you. And all of us are trying to figure this out at the same time. And the other thing I will say is actually COVID has provided other opportunities. For example, the APSA meeting's going on right now, and because it's virtual, everybody could attend. And you can actually get online and you could listen to the sessions, and you could chat. And like for the first time in like ever, you could actually just talk to the guy who's presenting, and he'll probably answer, he or she will answer you back and tell you how they did that essay. And this is it's amazing that we're entering a completely different world in terms of how we communicate and how we share research and how we share education. I think it's going to be pretty awesome. And so I think I would just embrace it. So I guess one last thing I will say is, seek those opportunities. So let's say that you finish and you don't know what you want to do, but look around. I mean, there's all these topics in your field that is not studied, that nobody knows anything about. Pick that esoteric topic that nobody knows anything about and make that your passion, because you will then become the expert in that thing. So I think that in this COVID situation, even though it's really hard on everybody, this will create a whole bunch of new opportunities. Our ability to communicate with each other across totally different locations, and to be able to share data, to be able to work collaboratively with other people, it's going to break down all kinds of silos that we currently have. So I think you guys will be special in being part of the COVID generation, and you'll learn how to do things that I don't know how to do because I'm not so techie as you guys are. and you'll actually teach me a lot of new things. So I think I would embrace it.
All right, and then the very last question for you before we move on, sorry, I have to scroll back, okay, is how do you find out what are realistic asks in terms of asking for academic time and salary in the current job market?
So there are a couple of good sources. So actually, that's a really good question. We just finished a manuscript on negotiations, which is under review. So hopefully, if that comes out, that's right, Marion's giving me a thumbs up. Hopefully, that comes out. That'll give you guys all kinds of good information. It was done by a bunch of awesome women in AWS. So AAMC is a good source that everybody refers to if you were talking about salary. There is MGMA, which is more of the kind of professional, like a clinical, non-academic salary survey. These are basically surveys that they sent out to the selected people, and then they generate a report every year that gives you kind of like the market, what the market looks like. This is generally the 25th percentile, 50th percentile, 75th percentile, 90th percentile for salaries. If you look at I think some of the other things like Medscape, Doximity, you could Google some of this stuff. Also, recruiters sometimes have that information, so you could reach out to recruiters even if you're not actually interested in the jobs that they have. But they have data about locations and what's available there and what's the general salary and stuff. If you AAMC, the faculty report is sometimes easy to find, sometimes hard, but most of the time your library or your librarian could get it for you, because most universities actually carry that as a report in their library. So it really should not be that hard to get, but sometimes people have trouble finding it. But I think usually your librarian could get that for you. As a matter of fact, I just pull that exact same information from our librarian. It's just like an email to them. Anyhow, so that's one way to find out about salary. It's also completely fair to ask your mentors or your colleagues. I would just say, are you okay if we talk about money? Are you okay would you be comfortable telling me what you make? Because I'm just trying to figure out what's normal. Or would you be comfortable telling me what you started with when you got your first junior job? Now, just remember that if you're going to ask a faculty that's 5 years out what they made when they first came out, you've got to add a whole bunch of money to that, because the salaries sort of, there's obviously an inflation component to that. So you have to kind of figure out what that might be. In terms of what was fair to ask for time, that is a little bit of, it's really kind of a business plan. So you could ask for whatever time you want, but there's a cost and benefit to that, right? So they'll say, I'll give you 80% time, but I will pay you at 20% of what's the market rate. So you just have to, that's completely a discussion about what you're willing to give up. And then actually the manuscript we wrote, a lot of it was about that, was about knowing yourself while asking yourself the most important questions of where I want to be, and then taking that and then writing out for yourself what you want. And then always it is an issue of, what am I willing to pay to be able to get this benefit? For some people, they need to live in a certain area, so they will take a little bit of less of a pay. For some people, they want to be able to do research, so they're willing to give this up. If you aren't willing to give either up, then you have to say, okay, I want you to give this to me, but only for 3 years. And I promise you, I will give you return on your dollars, because in 3 years, I will give you this. And then if you can't get that grant or whatever in 3 years, or start that program in 3 years, then you should be okay with them saying, I'm going to close this up because I've already invested this and I didn't get the really kind of the return on my investment that I really wanted.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pine. We're very glad you were able to participate with us. We are going to go on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Mary Brindle. Dr. Brindle completed her medical degree at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and her general surgery residency at the University of British Columbia. She went on to become a research fellow at Stanford University, and then complete her pediatric surgery fellowship at the University of Toronto and Masters of Public Health at Harvard University. She is currently the Associate Department Head of Surgery at Cummings Medical School, University of Calgary, and the Division Chief of Pediatric Surgery. And she also is the Director of the EQUIS, Efficiency, Quality, Innovation, and Safety Research Platform at Alberta Children's Hospital. Welcome, Dr. Brindle.
Thank you so much. I was really honored to be a part of this, and I think Dr. Hayes-Jordan may have already left, but it was particularly nice to see her on the call today. When I was at Sick Kids, she was in Toronto. She was a couple of years ahead of me, and I mean, honestly, for the first few months I was there, I think that was all I heard about was how great she was. So I felt that there was a high bar to meet when I was there. So I've had leadership in a number of areas, and I think I'll talk a little bit about my experiences in research leadership as well as in more operational leadership. And since I provided that information, I have now agreed to take on a position as the Director of Safe Surgery, Safe Systems at Atul Gawande's Ariadne Labs, which I'll be starting this summer. And I've taken on some provincial leadership here in Alberta in terms of surgical strategy. So, and one of the things I think anyone in leadership learns is that leadership is constantly evolving. And it was one of the key things that I think I realized after my first few years in practice is that you have to have a bit of a plan for self-evolution and certainly expect that you are not going to be the same person in 3 to 5 years that you were when you started, and your desires and what you're going to do may change. Pretty early on, I sort of caught on to the idea of creating strategies and plans for where I wanted to see myself in another year or another two. A lot of research, I think, if you want to create a program of research, if you want to lead a program of research, is about that vision. So I think it's one of the important things is to develop a bit of a structure, a vision, a mission, and then craft a little bit of your sort of career plans around that, recognizing that things do change and things evolve. There was a point when I had finished my MPH, and I was putting together some plans, and I decided to construct a research platform, assuming that I had consistent yearly funding, which I didn't have at the time, but I just wrote it all out, who the teams would be, longitudinal plans, longitudinal structure, who would, sort of be fitting into each role, where my collaborators would be. I had established a strong mentorship, and now this I recognize is pure luck, but a donor was looking for a place to put money at our children's hospital, and they were asking around, and I could put this thing forward. So, I mean, how often does that happen in your life? Not very often, but I like to think that Louis Pasteur said, fortune favors the prepared mind. And I think in those situations, when you have a bit of a game plan, things often fall together. You look for opportunities, and when those opportunities aren't there, you create them when you can, and constantly be aware that your plans may need to evolve. In research leadership, there was a lot that's been said about mentorship, and I think we all recognize the value. One thing I'd say is that you may be lucky to find one mentor who kind of answers all of the things for you and is that mentor in all ways. I found that for me, I found mentorship in different areas. I did have strong pediatric surgical mentors. Some of those were clinical, some of those were research. Some of my greatest research mentorship came from very short mentorship meetings with someone who's in a totally different area of medical research, but could help me reflect on kind of the research programmatic thinking that I was having and where I wanted to go. And I think as a bit of an outsider, but someone who was engaged in a similar type of way of looking at a research program, it was really helpful to be able to gather ideas from this person to create a structure which is consistent and is ongoing. So in terms of my operational leadership, I did a lot of work as a division chief, and then I ended up taking on departmental work and eventually provincial work. And some of those leadership positions almost came up by chance, or just opportunities that arose where I was in the right place at the right time. And I think that knowing how to take advantage of those is good. A little has been said about seizing opportunities, and I think there is a real art to, we're always told, learn to say no, and I think that's really important. I also think it's really important when you're starting to know when to say yes, and to say yes to the right opportunities, the things where you actually have a passion, where there's something that you can build and you can create within that role. And I think that those roles within committees and within, for us, it's sort of provincial health systems leadership, as well as within the university, give you this opportunity to take on roles and kind of show the sort of person you are. I've got to say, in surgical leadership, where I came from, there was a long history of leadership that looked very similar year to year to year over decades. It was leadership that was, and this is not a problem really, but it's sort of older men who had grown up and spent their life in Calgary, established their careers in Calgary, and there was a leadership style that was, relatively assertive, relatively cut and dry, and that was not my leadership style. I would say that learn from other people. There isn't one right leadership style, and recognize what suits you. So for me, the things that I felt were important for me to develop as a leader were to be principle-based, it was to be decisive. So you don't want to be someone who isn't able to make hard decisions. It's really important that you're able to do that pretty early on, but nothing is ever personal. You do want to be compassionate, you want to be understanding, you want to work with people. I would say one thing that I have witnessed very early on in leadership is, even though it is sometimes tempting when you know how right you are and how wrong the other person is, never make someone lose face. Always treat the other person with respect, treat yourself with respect. Respect who you are when you come to the table. Don't let someone disrespect you, but also don't allow, even when people say something is foolish, or even if they fly off the handle and you're irritated with them, if you come to every state of conflict or any point where you have to come to a decision with that mutual respect, I'd say that is going to serve you very well in the long term, because those same people that you have had a conflict with at one point almost guarantee at some point down the line you're going to need to work with that person. So I think it's very important to be able to bring those things moving forward. A little bit too about this feeling of having a mission or principles. I remember when I was a division head in pediatric surgery, and it was one of my first operational leadership roles, and one of my colleagues asked me what my 5-year plan was. And I realized that I had a plan, but it didn't really stretch out to that point, and it wasn't as comprehensive as it could have been. That was pretty early when I started. And I've got to say that now, when I am taking on any major leadership role, I take that time to write down the things that I want to do within that role, the things that are important to me. They're going to be, no matter what kind of leadership job you do, there is going to be that element of that job that is bureaucracy and red tape and the meetings that you have to attend that you don't really have as much to contribute to, but there are huge possibilities of making change. As someone who is a health systems researcher myself, I came from a point when you're sort of finishing your residency and you're starting a staff, that administration feels a little bit like the them and you are the us, and that they are always the people that you're fighting against to get what you want. And once you start transitioning into that role of being able to do some of that decision making, I think that you realize very early on that there is a huge amount that you can do of great value to the people who were just like you when you were in their position, starting in a role like 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think that valuing the job, don't value the position, value the mission. And I think that if you can do that in the job, then people will see that, and then you will work with people and you will grow a program, whether it is within your research or growing a program more within an operational sphere. So I mean, those were sort of my observations that I went through when I was going through leadership, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. One question that we did have is, do you think that the environment for training and practice is different with respect to women in the US versus Canada? And would you say one is more conducive than the other or better than the other?
Well, it's a good question. And I've got to say that in pediatric surgery, I think there's a fair bit of movement between the two. There's differences between the Canadian American systems that I think are challenging, and I think particularly when it comes to things like research. Now, in terms of whether it's male or female, it's a little hard to say. The one advantage that I'd say that I think, especially if you're balancing a lot in your life, is that you can, I think, thrive earlier on in research in Canada because a little less of it is driven by early success with grants. Now, I've got to say that's, no matter what, you've got to achieve that at some point. But for example, in Canada, most of our sort of NIH-style grants do not provide salary. Some do, but most of them do not. And certainly once you're established, there's an expectation that the place where you work provides that. So a lot of the pediatric surgical programs, if you take on a role that has either a strong academic position or a strong research position, most of those pediatric jobs have that built into it. That is a bit of an advantage, but that's really just kind of a global statement. It really depends on what you look at in which program.
I'm not sure, are there any other questions out there for Dr. Brindle? Oh, I don't think I've seen any new ones pop up. I'll give a little bit of time in case any, oh, here's a new one. How do you climb the operational leadership ladder?
I think it's a good question. The one thing is that you definitely have to put in the effort and the time, and you have to commit yourself to to be a team member before you take on a role as a leader. I think some of these things too, in surgical leadership also is interesting. One is that it is very hard to succeed as a leader in surgery if people don't respect you as a surgeon. I think that is an area of leadership where surgery differs from some other areas of leadership in the academic or medical community. So you want to get a foundation where you are comfortable, where you are secure. You want to start taking on roles that are meaningful. So it comes a little bit back to choosing the right committees to participate in and choosing the right activities. There are certain committees that kind of are the beginning and end in of themselves. They don't influence other places. You don't build from them. Those are the kinds of committees that sometimes you want to take one or two of those at some point, but you really want to minimize your participation in those. But then when you see that there is something that is coming up, like for example, COVID, for example, has provided amazing opportunities for people who are interested in leadership development in the operational sphere, because there is just so much that needs to be done. There's so many responses that need to happen. And when you recognize things like that, needs that come up, it doesn't need to be COVID. It can be a change in the system, whether it's opening up a new OR, whether it's like a new clinic and things like that, to get yourself in at that point to say, I'd really like to be a part of this so that I can help figure out the best ways to adapt this or the problems that were going to occur, and get yourself right into that. I think that helps. One of the things I see that someone's commented on this is leadership training. I think that's actually a great thing as well. And it's interesting that almost all of us who become leaders in surgery have trained in medical school and have done their residencies and just sort of become leaders through experience. And experience alone is excellent, but it is not everything. I've taken a number of leadership courses, some very, very formal with very practical advice in it. Others are a little bit more reflective. I think a good mix of those two is very helpful in kind of setting yourself up for leadership success.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Brindle. I don't know if there are any other last minute questions. If not, we will move on to our last speaker, who is Dr. Ayla Stanford. Welcome, Dr. Stanford. Dr. Stanford completed her medical school at Penn State University College and her general surgery residency at State University of New York. She went on to complete pediatric surgery fellowship at Children's Hospital Pittsburgh and Cincinnati Children's. And she is currently the Director of Minority Health and Health Disparities at Temple University School of Medicine, and currently in private practice, and the founder of Stanford Pediatric Surgery. So welcome, Dr. Stanford.
Hi. Hi, everybody from Philadelphia. I'd like to say I tried to, but this was kid day, so I'm in my kid attire. And there was no time to change, but hi. So I guess I'll start with the private practice entity and how I got into it first. Can you guys all hear me okay? Okay, awesome. And it's interesting because I was always, my first job was Temple Children's in Philadelphia. And then I was at St. Chris. And then I was at CHOP. And I was at Cooper in Camden for a minute. And I was just trying to find the fit of having 3 children, 3 sons. And finally, as I was on the PTO and all these different things, parents would say, I had to drive all the way down the CHOP for my son to get their appendix out. And we live in the suburbs, which is 12 miles away from CHOP. It's not that far. But for folks that live out here, they didn't want to drive and park and have to deal with the parking and getting lost on the campus and all of that, and wanted to know why they couldn't have certain procedures in their community. And so I decided to go into private practice, which people thought was ludicrous. But I figured I knew all the pediatricians. I apologize. Maybe I can get my husband to get the dog out of here. I knew all the pediatricians in the community, and they had known me. I mean, my first job out of fellowship in 2006 was this community. And so for them, it didn't matter if I worked for the hospital or if I worked for myself. And so I came up with the name. Believe it or not, Stanford Pediatric Surgery wasn't taken. And so formed a business with that premise and did mainly bread and butter stuff. And of course, the first year I made no money. And when I say I made no money at all. But I had started doing some consulting work where adults kept asking me about the best cardiologist, which I'm sure your friends ask you from time to time about, the best breast surgeon, the best whomever, but they were willing to pay me for it. So I had maintained my adult general surgery. So that gave me some validation, and just started reading up on common diseases, and then set up my own consulting firm as well. So that supplied me income. And I basically had, and most people will tell you, to be in anything that's a doctorpreneurial type situation, you need more than one revenue stream. And so I ultimately had 3 revenue streams. So one was my private practice. The second was my consulting firm. And the third was, there's a hospital that's 40 miles from here in sort of mid-Jersey called St. Peter's. And one of their pediatric surgeons was retiring. And they asked, would I be part of the call schedule, just so they wouldn't have to be every other. So that worked out great because they have, you know, a 60-bed NICU, and they were getting lots of interesting index cases. And so I started to do that. And I did that on average 8 days a month. So I had control over my schedule. So it worked out to 1 weekend and some call days during the week. And so my 3 revenue streams were taking call for a hospital. The other was my private practice, and the third was my consulting. And through those 3 things, I was able to maintain the same lifestyle as I was working for an academic institution, but most importantly, it gave me freedom and control over my life. So the only thing I didn't have control were the 8 days I was on call. But when I was on call at 6 a.m., I signed out to the person I was on call, and that was it. And then I went back to life as mom and for my private practice and things like that. So that's how I got into that right now. And that's been working for me. So I started that in 2017, and it's 2020 and still going. Now, obviously right now, no one's doing emergency, or they're only doing emergency cases. And so where I was working in St. Peter's, there were no elective cases, so they didn't need as many surgeons. And as I was sitting home in Philadelphia, hearing about the disproportionate number of African Americans that had been affected by COVID-19, I said, well, first I was going to New York because I have a New York license. And I was like, I'm going to New York. And my husband was like, no, you're not. I was like, I'm going to New York. I'm sitting here doing nothing. And then I was on the emergency list for Abington Jefferson. So they asked me not to go. So in any case, I'm sitting here, and in Philadelphia, African Americans are 44% of the population, but they're representing 55% of the deaths. And so I reached out to the city, like, what's happening? How can I help? Do you have increased testing sites? What's happening? And I got crickets. There was nothing happening. There were no more resources. There were no more testing sites. And I sprung into action and basically said, okay, I need PPE, which I have in my office because I do in-office procedures. I need testing kits, and I had a handful, and some of my other colleagues also had them. Since everyone was doing telehealth, no one was actually seeing patients. And I need transportation if we're going to test people mobily, and testing kits. If I didn't say that, testing kits. So I grabbed those. So in any case, I put it on my consulting website that we were going to be testing people for COVID, that your only criteria were that you needed to have symptoms, or you had been exposed to someone who was a known positive or presumed positive. And those were the only 2 criteria. Because in Philly, you had to have a referral, and a lot of folks didn't have a PCP, or if they showed up at a hospital and their doctor was on staff somewhere else, they wouldn't take you. If you showed up on foot and it was a drive up, they wouldn't take you. I mean, there were so many stories of people being turned away who all started to call me. So in any case, we went out. The first day we tested about 15 people. And again, because I'm a private practitioner, I have an account with LabCorp. I have an account with Quest. So I said, I want to order 1,000 testing kits. And they're like, yeah, right. And I said, no, I want to order 1,000 testing kits. I think we can test 250 people a day. And most people were only doing 100 a day, most academic institutions. And we put the word out on social media, the radio stations, TV, everything. And the next day we tested 150 people. And the following day we tested 380 people. And it just kept growing and growing. And right now, we've had 15 sessions and we've tested 3,998 people. And it just keeps growing. And it's really kind of surreal. I think this is the first time I've talked about it, like how it went from step to step to step. But the profound gratitude you get going into the community is just, I mean, I can't even put it into words how grateful the people are. How often I've had children where both parents are positive and they want to get their kids tested and no one will test them. And then the kids come back positive. And then oftentimes they say, well, do you have someone who can do kids? And I was like, actually, yes, there is someone who can do children. And how many people pull up and say, you know, my father just died, or someone in my church just died, and can I get tested? Or we had a carload of people in a convertible yesterday, and I said, you're sitting on each other's laps. How are you socially distancing? And they said, well, our sister's in the hospital, and we all live with her, so this is how we live together anyway. I was like, well, I couldn't really argue with that. And we tested them. So it's been an interesting experience watching how a group of individuals, and we're all volunteer doctors, nurses, medical students who have no electives right now, right? And I can't let them test. They want to touch the patients, but I don't let them do anything. I let them sign the tubes and things like that. And all volunteer people, anesthesiologists, surgeons, GI doctors, family practice, pediatricians, and we're out there every day, 20 deep, and we just test people all day in the rain, in the wind. Sometimes now it's warm. And it's again, I'm in some words, I'm speechless about it. And when LabCorp said, well, what are you going to do about the people with no insurance? I said, you're going to bill me. And they're like, what do you mean? Do you know how much that can be? And I said, well, how much is the test? And they said, first it was $51. Some of you might remember. And then it was $100 because they had to increase the personnel. And I said, you're going to bill me. And I'm going to figure out later how to get my money back from the government. But for now, anyone who's not insured, you send the bill to Stanford Pediatric Surgery. They were like, okay. And then the rest is history. And then every time we sent in 300 testing kits, they sent us 300 back. Every time we sent 500 specimens, they sent us 500 back. And our positivity rate has been on par with the national average or above it, which is obviously disheartening, but just supports why we need to be out there. So, all right, I'll stop there. That was more than I would have said last week, but you know, a lot has happened in the past 4 weeks, all because we were sheltering in place. And I was going crazy watching CNN. And everyone was calling me. And this is so that's the other part. I'm from Philadelphia, born and raised. So all the elder folks have known me since I was itty bitty. And it's a big, small town, even though it's like the 5th largest city in the United States. So I could stop there. I see lots of chats.
Yes, a lot of people are very inspired by you. So thank you so much, Dr. Stanford. Thank you so much for joining us. We do have a couple of questions. Some of them are a little bit more related to your practice.
Sure, absolutely.
So one of the questions is, someone is curious to know how viable private practice pediatric surgery is, given last year's discussions on surgeons not performing a high number of index cases to maintain proficiency.
Oh, that's an excellent question, and it depends on where you are. I mean, this is my 49th year of living, so I've been, I'll put that out there, it's my 49th year. So I've been a doctor now for 23 years. I mean, that's a long time, right? So for me, I don't need to do 1,200 cases a year anymore. You know, I don't need to do every TEF and every imperforatus. But everybody is at different points in their lives. And I have a 12-year-old and I have 10-year-old twins, all boys. It's like I enjoy being on the PTO. I enjoy swimming with them. I enjoy riding bikes. So for me, doing, I want to say 250 to 300 cases is okay for me, right? That's okay for me, but that's not okay for everyone. And I wouldn't necessarily say this is something to do in the beginning of your career when you first finish fellowship. And I certainly didn't. I was operating on everything moving. I also didn't have any kids yet either. And so I was still doing fellowship hours, like super early and coming home super late and eating lots of takeout, right? But how I support my index cases is that there happened to be a hospital 40 miles away from me that I still have a gastroschisis in the middle of the night, you know, and I still have to put a central line in a preemie. And I still have the pneumoperitoneum. And the beautiful thing for me is that typically when you start with that patient, that's your patient. Like you can't go out of town and you can't, unless you have partners that are willing to take on your responsibility. The beautiful thing for me in my situation is that the hospital is grateful to have a pediatric surgeon. And so I really am the doc that's there from 6A to 6A, or when I cover through for the weekend from Friday at 6A through Monday at 6A. But I'm on staff for the hospital. But in the morning, I sign out to the docs that are there, and that's their full-time job. So it gives me enough of still keeping my hands, you know, things that I still need to wear loops for, but not as robust as if you were at, you know, an academic center. Not to mention, CHOP is down the street from my house, St. Chris is on the way to CHOP, and DuPont is across the bridge. Cooper is across the bridge. So there are over 25 pediatric surgeons in this 40-mile, you know, sort of square radius, right? And so it may not work everywhere, but again, for me, I don't feel bad when I don't take an appy because you've got tons of other places to go, right? So how robust? It depends on how busy you want to be. But there's a shortage of pediatric surgeons everywhere. So if you could find a location that would actually hire you, not a locums person, because if you're hired, you can still get benefits, you can still participate in the retirement account and all of those sorts of things, right? And I like them and they like me and it works, so.
Yeah, that's awesome. So another question that came up is about managing the finances in private practice. And do you enjoy the freedom that private practice gives you, or would you ever go back to academia?
So this was my year to decide all of that. This was my 49 year, was my kids are a little older. And like I said, there's tons of hospitals and people are retiring. I mean, let's just be honest, right? And most people, at least when you're older in your career, they like to take someone who has an established relationship in the community. And I feel that I have a good relationship in the Philadelphia and surrounding community. But then this happened with COVID. And I'm committed to see this through with everyone who needs a test, getting a test, to next do the antibody testing on these folks at 3, 6, 9, 12-month intervals, to write up all of the data, which is fascinating. I mean, just some of the things that I'm seeing, I'm so intrigued by, and to use it as an opportunity to move the needle of all the poor health outcomes that are typically reported in African Americans with breast cancer and prostate cancer and colon cancer and even asthma for the children, to be able to have an opportunity to provide education, and while the focus is on the inequity, to really be part of the solution. And so I don't know is the answer because I want to see this through. I want to see this through, and there's real funding out here for it. I mean, I had a call today with the Ways and Means Committee. I had to double check and Google what that was, but there were all 202 area codes. I was like, this is Washington, D.C. This is like the real Ways and Means Committee, right? And So, I mean, people want to do something. And I think what's different with me is that, and us, is that we started with the community as opposed to sitting at a table and coming up with an idea that should work in the community. We started with the people. So usually people are trying to get numbers of African Americans to participate in a study. We have 4,000 people. I mean, that's like unheard of for a database that we'll be able to compare to other groups by insurance or non-insurance, by age group, by male and female, by symptoms or no symptoms, by was it a contact person that you got from work or from home? I mean, is it city or suburb? I mean, there's so many questions that I'm honestly fascinated by, that I think that I'm gonna put on my public health hat for a little bit and see this through.
Okay. And then we have, I think, one more question before we head towards our breakout rooms. And that is, it's kind of a two-part question. It goes back to how you manage the finances in private practice. And in terms of your positions at the other hospitals, are they per diem, where, you know, it's only when you take call, or how does that work?
Excellent questions. Excellent. Because I negotiated my butt off. I totally negotiated. I talked to all my friends who were doing locums. You know, do you have to do ECMO? Do you have to do trauma? You know, just how often you have to go in. What's a daily census like? And I came up with my own rate for what I thought it should be. And I made it high. And it's a 24-hour rate. So some people do you come in at a certain time. But again, as I mentioned, I was hired, so I'm on staff. So now that I have a set amount, I can't negotiate from that. But it's a daily rate. And I have to commit to do a minimum of 5, but I've done up to 12 days a month for them when someone was out ill. And I negotiated what my rate was. And so through that, it's a W-2, you know, the taxes come out, it's great. Now, through my private practice, and this was not fun, but I had to become in network with all the providers and get on board, which was painful to do. It honestly probably took me 6 to 8 months to do what typically we show up somewhere and we just sign all these things, just where they tell us a sticky that says sign here, sign here, sign here. Well, it's different when you have to do it yourself. But now I'm in network with all the different providers. And because I was in network before working for the hospital, they had already done the vetting process. So I just had to do it under my private practice. I would say I could probably do better with my billing for the private practice. And there's probably a lot of money that I don't get paid for because I'm not the best with the consults. I'm just being honest. I'm pretty good with the cases. But the fees to pay a billing service are so high for what I make in the private practice that for me, it didn't make sense. So it's those 3 things together. And then my consulting business is all cash. So that's real easy. Just pay me. And then I get a 1099 at the end of the year. So how I manage it, and I should, in full disclosure, my husband is a financial planner and CPA, so that's also very helpful.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stanford. We really appreciate you joining us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to Claudia Amami, who's going to do our closing remarks and help us.
Oh, wow. It's nice to see you guys. I just clicked the big screen. Wow.